I'm going to talk about mining. And this phrase, the basalt economy on Mars, a slightly curious phrase, will become apparent in a moment. Just to set the scene, as Cole discussed, this is, of course, what we all aim for, I guess, on this symposium today. Some of these images real in the top left, SpaceX and Blue Origin, many of them depictions of what we would like to achieve. And I guess for today, our greatest interest are those images in the bottom of this slide, establishing a permanent human presence on Mars. And one of the ways in which we can do this, and one of the ways that interests me, I'm a microbiologist at the University of Edinburgh. I study microbes in extreme environments. One of the ways in which we can establish human presence in space is by using microorganisms. And I'm not going to, as I say, we don't have much time. I just wanted to point out a few things to set the scene. Microbes are everywhere, and they are involved in a whole range of industrial and useful processes that you may or may not be aware of. If you look in your fridge, you'll see things like beer and wine and bread and yogurt. All these things are produced by microorganisms. Then they don't just cause disease. And they come in a whole variety of shapes and forms that do different functions. For example, image C in the top left, there you can see some filamentous cyanobacteria, which produce oxygen. So you can immediately see potential links to production on Mars. On the right-hand side, I just show a phylogenetic tree. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, just to point out that bacteria and archaea shown there are unicellular microorganisms, and there are also microorganisms in the eukaryotes. So the vast diversity of genetic information on the Earth today is microbial. We live on a microbial world. If we're going to go into space, rather than just ignoring these organisms, a good idea is to mobilize them to do useful things to help us establish a permanent presence. And again, in the interest of time, let me just whip through some examples of the way in which microbes can be useful, and then show you the data that I wanted to discuss today of what we've been up to using microorganisms to do biomining. So I showed those cyanobacteria producing oxygen. We could use microorganisms in life support to produce oxygen or recycle waste or fix nitrogen. We can use microorganisms to produce drugs. So there are many people working on developing chassis microorganisms which you can introduce genes into and have them produce drugs on demand. If you're on Mars, you don't want to be shipping every known drug to humanity all the way from Earth to Mars. You want to be able to synthesize these things in situ, depending upon, for example, diseases or medical ailments that may emerge. So designer or on-demand drug production using microorganisms as factories is one use of microbes. We might use them to produce different types of biofuels, bioethanol, methanol, other forms of organic compounds that are useful and have been demonstrated to be produced by microorganisms. We can also use them in soil formation. The volcanic rock on Mars is actually nutrient rich. Volcanic soils are some of the most fertile in the world. They have potassium, phosphorus, calcium, all sorts of elements in them, but what they lack is carbon and nitrogen. And on Mars, the regolith is nutrient rich for many elements, but not in carbon and nitrogen. And you can use microorganisms to ameliorate regolith by simply adding them to Martian soil and having them introduce fixed nitrogen and carbon. So we can use them in soil formation, and then we can also use them to produce plastics. Polyhydroxybutirates, for example, are precursors of plastics, and at Berkeley, they have microbes that produce these PHBs, genetically modified microbes that produce these precursors of plastic materials. So we think of plastics as coming from petroleum. You can actually make them using microbes that synthesize the organic precursors for plastics, and so on, many other products. And then finally, we can use microbes in biomining. About 20% of the world's copper and gold is today extracted from rocks using microorganisms. So this is a large-scale activity on the Earth today, biological mining. That's what I want to talk about. But this slide is just to show you that microbes are not something on the side. They can be mobilized to be a fundamental part of the human movement out into space, and particularly on the surface of Mars. And maybe you can think up other uses of these microorganisms on Mars. So I want to get straight to my talk focus here, which is mining elements from rocks using microbes, biomining, used widely on the Earth. Now, we don't know what ores are available on Mars. We know there's lots of basalt, which I just mentioned. And on the right-hand side, you can see a lump of good old standard basalt, very common on the Earth, and all the different elements in that piece of rock that have industrial use. I'm not going to go through all of those, but you can have a look at those, and you can see that in principle, even non-ore quality rocks on Mars contain many of the metals and other elements that civilization needs to perform certain functions. And 2 years ago and last year, we launched 2 experiments for the International Space Station, one called BioRock, one called BioAsteroid, led by my lab at Edinburgh in collaboration with ESA and NASA. I'm not going to talk about the politics of that, but simply get to some results in the interest of time to illustrate what I want to talk about. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that, just to reiterate, basalt is a very common material. You may have heard of it. It's just volcanic rock. Most of Mars is basalt, and large proportion of the moon is also made of basalt, contains all these elements. As I say, it's not ore quality. You wouldn't go and mine this stuff on the Earth, at least not at the moment, for commercial reasons. But if you're on the moon and Mars, you might end up finding this is the material you have around your station, and it might be good to be able to extract the needed elements from this material. So in our experiments, we focused on mining basalt, but in principle, we could put ores in there if we found them on Mars. So this is a space biomining reactor that we've developed over 10 years with Kaiser and the European Space Agency. It's got a couple of growth chambers in there, and you can see the basalt slides in there, essentially an analog rock to Mars. And you inject the fluid, and the experiment is initiated on the space station. And here is Luca Parmitano, the astronaut, looking after the experiment. And the experiment ran for 21 days. We launched 3 microorganisms into space to study their different biomining capabilities. These are microbes naturally found in rocks. The Sphingomonas desicabilis was our sort of star biomining microbe. So we launched it up to the space station on commercial resupply mission 18 with SpaceX under contract with the European Space Agency. These are our microbes launching from Kennedy. Nothing much to say about this other than it's very exciting when you spent 10 years planning an experiment to see it in a Dragon capsule docking with the International Space Station. Ultimately, of course, we'd like to do this on the moon and Mars, pending, of course, planetary protection regulations. But anyway, here's our experiment. We put it inside a centrifuge because in our experiment, we studied simulated Earth gravity as a control, microgravity, which is essentially a lack of gravity on the International Space Station. But we also did one of the first experiments in space testing the effects of Martian gravity on the ability of microbes to mine rocks. And you can do this using this cubic apparatus on the space station that you can see has a centrifuge in the middle there. So if you spin it at 3/8 G, your experiment is at Martian gravity. And this enabled us to study how Martian gravity affected the ability of microbes to mine rocks. And in this short talk, I just want to say something about rare earth elements and our ability to mine those. Rare earth elements are actually not rare on the Earth, despite their name. But they're relatively rare compared to most other elements. And they cover a whole range of elements here that you can look at. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but you can see that rare earth elements, because of their electronic properties, find uses in mobile phones, in batteries, in computer screens, in lasers, high power magnets, and so on and so forth. In fact, they're ubiquitous. Mining these things is essential. Everything from electric cars to, as I say, your mobile phones depend on these. So if we build a civilization beyond the Earth, let's say on Mars, we will need rare earth elements for a variety of different needs. And of course, you could mine those on the Earth and you could launch them to Mars. But if you want to create a self-sustaining settlement, it would be good to be able to get these things on your own. So what did we demonstrate? Well, in this experiment on ISS, we demonstrated to get to the point that we could enhance the extraction of rare earth elements from Martian simulant basalt up to several 100%. On the left-hand side, you can see a graph with the rare earth elements on the x-axis and the increase in the release of elements caused by biology compared to the non-biological control. And these top curves here belong to Sphingomonas desicabilis, which is our star microbe for extracting these elements. There are no error bars on here for those of you who have noticed that. But the statistics are all in the paper. So only if you put the error bars here, you end up with a big mess. If you're interested in the stats, you have a look in this paper. To get to the point about Mars, what we found is that rare earth element biomining was as efficient in microgravity and Martian gravity compared to Earth gravity. And that was a surprise because gravity is known to affect fluid dynamics, both settling and the thermal convection in fluids. So the question is, why was there no difference between microgravity, Earth gravity, and Mars gravity? We think that the reason is that because the experiment was 21 days long, all of the cells managed to reach the same final concentration in the different gravities, regardless of gravity. In other words, there may have been a difference early on, but later on in the experiment, the bacteria managed to use up all the nutrients, reach the same concentration, and thereby do the same level of biomining. And that's of interest to Mars, because it might suggest that the 3/8 Martian gravity will not significantly impact bioindustrial processes. As long as you leave things for long enough, things will mine whatever you're doing or do recycling, and 3/8 Martian gravity is not a problem for industry. But this is one experiment, one set of organisms, so I'd be cautious about making too many generalized insights. But clearly, studying what happens under Martian gravity is of general interest. Where would we mine rare earth elements in the solar system? Well, there are quite high concentrations on the moon contained in rocks called creep rocks, that's so-called because they contain high concentrations of potassium, rare earth elements, and phosphorus. Nevertheless, these rare earth elements are still about 10 to 100 times less concentrated than, for example, rare earth element ores in China. So I don't think at any time we're going to be going to other planets to mine rare earth elements and bring them back to the Earth. I just wanted to emphasize that because there's a lot of speculation about mining in the solar system and what we might eventually do. So what I'm saying here is that these processes might be used to mine in situ on Mars and the Moon, but not necessarily to bring these things back to the Earth. And on Mars, we could use basalt, but it also remains an open question as to whether there are economically interesting ores on Mars that might have higher concentrations of rare earth elements. There are large hydrothermal systems on Mars and ancient impact craters and volcanic environments. So in theory, as on Earth, those hydrothermal systems should have concentrated elements, just like they do on Earth, to make economically viable ores. But we don't know that at the moment. So a forthcoming challenge is to prospect for ores on Mars. Anyone out there interested in mining, go and find out what ores are on Mars. Finally, just to say, we also demonstrated vanadium biomining. Vanadium is interesting because if you add it to steel, it makes steel abrasion and thermal fluctuation resistant. And if you know on Mars, of course, there's abrasion from Martian dust storms and huge thermal fluctuations caused by the temperature variations on that planet. If you want to build things out of steel, you might want to get hold of some vanadium that you can add to that steel to make it abrasion and thermal fluctuation resistant. It's also used as a neutron absorber in reactor materials and in batteries. So vanadium is also a very interesting element that one might want to try and mine or concentrate on the surface of Mars. So just to get to the final conclusion here, what I hope I've done in this very short, brief talk is to illustrate to you that biology and microbes are really interesting for Mars exploration. If any of you are thinking about these questions, think about microbes and what they might do. And I've given you one example of the way in which we might use microorganisms in the process of mining to extract elements from rocks on Mars. Note that what I've shown you is very limited. It's a tiny experiment on space station. We would still have to concentrate those elements. This is not a demonstration of commercial mining, but what we did in those experiments was demonstrate for the first time the principles of biological mining in space and under Martian gravity, and that this is something worth pursuing and looking at to establish this long-term vision. All of us on this symposium, I'm sure today, are excited by this depicted in the bottom of this image. So I'll stop there. Thanks a lot, Cole, for inviting me to the symposium, and just to encourage everyone taking part in this work to keep going with your work on Mars. I've been thinking about Mars on and off for many years, and it's just absolutely fantastic to be here and talk to you. I think we've probably got a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. This is Terry Rector. First, you stole my first one because I was going to ask you about the platinum group metals. We all understand their importance, especially here on Earth. And I'm military, so I'm definitely interested in their strategic value. But what about using microbes for production of helium or hydrogen, helium-3? Helium here on Earth, as we know, is in a limited capacity, and it's reducing every day. But what about helium-3 on the Moon?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And the simple answer is, I don't know, because it's an inertness. I don't know how you would mobilize it using microbes. But I suppose what microbes could do is they could break down the regolith and release that helium that would then be easier to extract from mine. So if you imagine a great machine going across the surface, say, of the moon and collecting large quantities of regolith, maybe you put it in a reactor and the microbes break down that regolith and release the helium that's trapped within the mineral particles. And in fact, because of the very inertness of helium, maybe that would be a good thing, because the microbes wouldn't use it as food. They would just ignore it and it would be released from the solution. So I think it's a very interesting question. It'll be interesting to try it out. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I guess I have a question if no one else is jumping in. Excellent presentation, Charles. Wondering, how do these microbial biomining efficiencies compare with the efficiencies from the robotic rare earth element mining?
Yeah, so microbes can be pretty efficient. I mean, it's one of the reasons why they used to do copper and gold mining, and there's now all sorts of papers being published on rare earth element mining on the Earth using microbes. So this is not, the biological mining concept is not pie in the sky. It's not space, it didn't come from space people. This is done on the Earth. And the efficiency results from the fact, well, it's two things. One, you don't have to use nasty chemicals like cyanides and other chemicals that are traditionally used to leach economically useful elements from rocks. So environmentally, they're a useful way to do things, but they're also energy efficient. I mean, microbes have been mining rocks for 3.5 billion years. That's how they get their food. So they've been up to mining for a long time. So they're very efficient at breaking down minerals and releasing what's in there and sequestering minerals, because essentially that's what they're evolved to do. So the efficiency, which can be on the orders of several % out of a rock, which is actually pretty good. It's easily comparable to chemical means of extracting elements. And the other thing you can do, of course, is microbes can move around. So you can inject them into rocks even without crushing rocks. So people have ideas of fracturing the rock. You inject the microbes in, and then you leave them there for a couple of months and you suck the liquid back out again, and you've got your elements. And people are trying to do that on the Earth at the moment, because that's even more or even less environmentally damaging, because you actually don't even have to dig up the rocks. So they're very promising on the Earth, and I think their use on a place like Mars is that they can use elements in the rocks you might not economically want as sources of nutrients to replicate. So the fact that organisms can replicate makes them mass, volume, and energy efficient with respect to space exploration, because you're not having to ship large quantities of cyanides and other chemicals from the Earth to Mars, or make them locally to then be able to do mining. You put your microbes in there, they eat the regolith as a source of food, and in the process they multiply and they break up the rock and release the elements you're actually interested in, like the rare earth elements that they don't do anything with or they don't modify in any way. So I think there's huge promise for use of biology in sustaining a human presence on Mars.
If there's no other questions, I got one more.
Okay, last one. Make it quick.
Okay, real quick. So I heard you say something about abrasiveness, because I do know that regolith is extremely corrosive to the spacesuits as well as to our wind, our breathing, and then also to building materials. Can microbes be used to smooth over the abrasive nature of regolith? And can they also be used to help make the material more construction friendly on Mars?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So they can be, they won't grow out on the surface of Mars in exposed conditions, of course, because there's no liquid water, but within a dome or in a habitat, you could put them on the regolith and they'll form a microbial biofilm over the surface. And that will ameliorate the regolith. It will stop it from being lifted in air currents up into the air around people. Literally microbial gardens, where the microbes are forming a soil crust, if you like. They're called microbial soil crusts. They bind the regolith together and they stop it from becoming dusty and drifting around. And there's some work, actually I did some work a few years ago on looking at use of cyanobacteria to bind soils and Martian regolith. The Chinese do this a lot because they don't like dust storms north of Beijing picking up dust and filling Beijing with it. So they've actually looked at work of spraying the desert with cyanobacteria to control surface sand. So you might do exactly the same thing on Mars within pressurized spaces.